Welcome to your first video homework assignment for first year English. Today's video is going to take a look at the rhetorical situation so that we can talk about rhetorical analysis. By the end of this video, you should know what the rhetorical situation is, what the term means, and how to identify the goals and the shape of a text. Now you're probably wondering, why does this matter? Why do I need to be able to analyze the things I read? And I've got 4 answers. First, being able to break the things you read down into parts helps you better understand the whole. If you can understand what each paragraph or even each sentence is doing, then you can put it all together and understand what the text is doing. Second, rhetorical analysis helps you find the problems in the text so that you can fix them. Third, being able to analyze a text thoroughly helps you understand that problems in parts don't mean that the whole thing needs to be thrown away, which is really helpful when you get that peer review feedback that says you need to make some revisions. And last but not least, knowing about the rhetorical situation helps you fine-tune your own writing and revising. It helps you think about who you're writing for and how you're reaching them. So let's get into the meat of it. The rhetorical situation is just a fancy term for a text, mission or main goal, and the shape it takes in order to achieve that goal. So it's very similar to following a Google map to get someplace that you want to go. And there's 4 parts or components to the rhetorical situation that are pretty similar to Google Maps directions. First, there's the reason or the purpose. This is what the text tries to do to the people who read, watch, or hear it. This would be similar to the ending point or the destination that you want to reach using the map. Second, there's the audience. Who does this text want to do these things to, or who does this text want to do these things for? This would be similar to asking yourself, well, who is going to get to this destination? Third is the form that the text takes. There's many different kinds, and these are often easy to spot just by eyeballing a text. And this would be similar to asking yourself, well, will we walk to our destination, drive, take the bus, or ride a bike? And last but not least, there's the thesis. What is the point of the argument? Why are we going to this destination? Now let's talk about each one of these components in a little bit more detail. So the reason or the purpose, as I said before, is the part where you think about what the text does successfully or what it tries to do. Not every text succeeds at the purpose that it sets out for, just like not every person arrives at the destination that they set out to reach. And again, the number 4 is going to be important because there's 4 basic purposes for any given text. A lot of texts try to inform you. They just want to give you facts or statistics or ideas and let you decide what to do with them from there. On the other hand, some texts want to convince you of an opinion. They might give you facts, but they also try to sway you to believe something based on those facts. And that's all mental, which is very different from the third purpose, which is to persuade. Persuasive texts ask you to get up and do something with the things that you believe or have been convinced to believe. And last but not least, some texts don't want to give you facts. They don't want to make you believe anything. They don't want you to do anything. They're just focused on how you feel. These are generally more artistic texts, like poems or songs. They want to stimulate your mind make you question things or think new thoughts. Or maybe they just want to soothe you, calm you down, make you feel good. Lullabies would be one example of soothing texts. They don't tell us anything we need to know. They don't try and influence our beliefs. They don't try and get us to do anything unless you count going to sleep. Now, every reason has an audience. If the text is trying to do something, it's trying to do it to someone. And the audience for a text can be named or unnamed. Some texts will be aimed at a general readership, but more often, texts will be aimed at specific groups. Now, those groups can be broken down by interest. Some texts will be aimed at people who want to know more about gardening. Some texts will be aimed at people who want to know more about teaching, or riding skateboards, or about surgery. Another way to break down your audience is to think about their demographics. How old are the people you'd like to read this? Where do they live? Where do they come from? What specific things matter to them in their everyday lives? And of course, these will overlap. So, for example, female gamers might be an audience. We've got demographic information with the gender, but we've also got information about interests with the gaming. Now, remember before when I said that some texts will somehow tell you who their audience is? Think about Scientific American. That's the name of a magazine. And the name tells you who it's for. And you can break that down by demographics. We know these are Americans, but also by interest. They're interested in science. Thinking about audience is very important as you shape your writing, but also as you figure out if you're the intended reader for the text that you're reading. The next thing to consider after reason and audience is form. Now, often this can be a very easy question to answer, but not always, especially with written text. This is the point where you ask, what is this thing that I'm looking at? Consider the urn to your left and the glass to your right. They have pretty similar shapes. Both are taller than they are wide. Both have circular openings at the top. Both have handles on the side. But they're meant for very different things. The same is true of any text that you read or experience. Thinking about the general or overall shape that the text takes is really important, but getting more specific is too. So there's virtual text that we all encounter every day, and these fly around in our phones and on our computers. There's informal texts that we often don't think about, but create and send very often as well. There's academic texts that you create for grades in class, but also during the process of trying to get that grade and make the final assignment. And then there's just a variety of other texts that we encounter and create and exchange all the time. So just be on the lookout for all the texts that you see around you and think about what category does this thing fall into as it's communicating ideas to me. Now, the last part of the rhetorical situation is the thesis. You've encountered this word over and over again, and it's just the argument that the text supports. Now, it's important to remember that a thesis is not a topic. A thesis makes a debatable or arguable statement and then proves it throughout an essay that supports that thesis. It's usually a complete thought, and it's usually an opinion or a little known fact if it's a fact. And as we've probably discussed in class, thesis statements are usually found at the end of the introduction in Western European or American texts. But in other kinds of texts, it might be found someplace else. So you have to look around and think a little bit. But we'll talk about that later. Just as a refresher, here's an example of a thesis. There are not enough healthy dining options on campus. Notice that this thesis gives an opinion or a judgment about the dining options. There's not enough of them. So now that you know all of the different parts of the rhetorical situation, you're probably wondering, well, how do I talk about this without going on and on? Here's a simple template. And again, as we've discussed in class, you can tweak this to meet your needs. But if you want to express your rhetorical analysis, you can simply say, title of the article or text is a whatever form you've determined it takes that seeks to whatever reason or purpose you figured out it wants, whatever audience you determine it's aimed toward, that or two, whatever the thesis of the text is. Here's an example. The Phenomenology of Error, the title, is a scholarly article, the form, that seeks to persuade, the reason or purpose, English teachers, the audience, to research different grammatical errors' effects on readers and only penalize student writers for making mistakes that truly stop readers from understanding the text. Which is my paraphrase of the thesis of that particular article. Now it's a little long and I could revise it, but I think it does a good enough job of saying what the text is, what it wants to do, to whom, and why. So now that you know what the rhetorical situation is and how to write it once you figure it out, we have to go backwards a little bit. How do you figure out the rhetorical situation? Well, the answer is think about what the text is made of, and also think about what the text is not made of. You always want to start with what you know or what you think. So we're going to go through each part of the rhetorical situation from reason to thesis, but you don't have to go in that order. You can start with the form because it's usually very obvious. Or you can start with the audience and then work from there. Whatever you do, you want to find proof or evidence to back up your conclusions. That evidence could come in the form of quotes, summaries, paraphrases, or different concrete strategies that the text uses. And you can use a chart like the one on the screen to organize your thoughts. Just make sure that for each conclusion you draw about each part of the rhetorical situation, there's something in the text that supports that idea. So how do you determine the purpose? Again, we're asking ourselves, well, what is it made of? And also, what is it not made of? So think about what information the text gives you. On the screen, you'll see a chart that gives you some partial examples of things to look for. If a text is very factual, and especially if it reports those facts through diagrams or other visuals, or if it gives you specific dates and events from history with a neutral tone, it's probably just trying to inform you. But if the text goes on to add opinions based on those facts, or if it uses stronger or more colorful language to express those opinions, then it's probably trying to convince you to agree with the author. Now, texts that try to convince you will also give a lot more support than just facts. They'll give examples, including anecdotes or stories, and they'll explain things a lot to try and get you to agree. Now, if the text goes on to tell you what you should do, or make a call to action, or even tell you straight out, do this, it's probably trying to persuade you. And if you notice that a text mostly relies on imagery or descriptions or sound devices like rhyme or even if it asks a lot of questions, it's probably trying to stimulate thought more than inform or persuade, or perhaps to soothe your emotions more than any other purpose. And it's important to note that any part of any text can do any of these. So within one essay, you might have one paragraph that's giving information, but then the same paragraph goes on to try and convince you to believe something based on that. This can also happen within the same paragraph. You can have one sentence that gives information, and then another sentence in the same paragraph that tries to persuade you based on that information. Or even a sentence that tries to stimulate thought by asking a question based on those facts. Just remember that when you're thinking about analyzing the whole text, you want to think about what happens most often and how the combinations of things work together. Now, how do you determine audience? How do you figure out who the text wants to appeal to? Well, you think about how it tries to appeal to people. One thing to look at is the reading level of a text. Are the sentences complex and long? Then it's probably not aimed at the same people that Clifford the Big Red Dog is aimed at. Think about vocabulary. Is it specialized so that only people who work or research in a certain field would understand what those terms mean? Or maybe it uses specialized vocabulary, but it explains what the terms mean so that even outsiders or non-professionals can get it. Then it's probably more for a general audience. Are there regional expressions or slang that only people in a certain place or age group would get? Those give you clues about who the text is for. There's also the subject matter. Some topics are more special interest, while others are general. Most of us like dogs, so that's probably a general interest audience. However, if the topic is how to care for your giant red dog, well, that sounds like special interest to me. Also think about the examples that the author gives or the voice that the author uses. So if the author uses we, think about who the author is, and that'll give you a hint about who the audience is, since they're obviously a part of the same group. Also, the examples that they give can give you a clue about who is intended to be reading this. This can go for pictures, or this can go for anecdotes or stories that are told. If those examples are mostly of young people, probably young people are the audience. And one more thing to consider is design and formatting. Look at that front cover for Clifford the Big Red Dog. There's a giant picture that takes up most of the cover. The letters are big. There's lots of red. It's designed to catch your eye. And we notoriously say that children have short attention spans and like bright, shiny things. So that's probably a clue that this is designed for children. But there's also the font size and color and symbols that are in other things that we create. For example, you probably wouldn't put emoji in an academic essay because they don't meet the right level of formality, but you would put them in a text message. So think about those things as you're trying to figure out who the text is intended for. Now, how to determine form. So we've talked about how form is what the overall shape, the text takes. But you can also think about the shapes that are embedded inside of the text. Those can give you a clue if you're not sure about the overall shape. Now, one aspect of shape is the length. There's a big difference between a trailer and a movie, just like there's a big difference between a short story and a novel, and a big difference between an article and a book chapter and a book. Also think about purpose. Just because things are of a similar length or have a similar purpose or have a similar medium doesn't mean that they're the same. You've probably all seen those sad, sad commercials for the ASPCA where Sarah McLachlan sings "In the Arms of the Angels" and there's pictures of abused animals. And you've probably also seen lots and lots of commercials for Burger King, for the newest cell phone, for the latest movie. Now, those ASPCA commercials are commercials, but they're a special kind. They're a PSA, a public service announcement, that doesn't ask you to spend money for a profit for them, but perhaps they ask you to spend money for the greater good of society. Or maybe they simply ask you to do something and not to spend money at all. On the other hand, conventional commercials always ask you to spend money so that someone else can profit. And those are two different forms of communication. Now you can also think about structure. So prose, or text that goes from margin to margin and is organized in sentences, is very different from a poem, which has line breaks, to say the least. There's also a big difference between a narrative versus an expository text. As you probably learned in high school, narratives have an exposition and a rising action and a climax and a falling action. And expository texts don't necessarily move that way. They have an introduction, they have body paragraphs that develop a thesis and a conclusion. And there's not the same kind of movement. So think about how ideas are put together in a text too. Now, just because ideas are put together similarly doesn't mean that they're the same, because there's content. Think about the difference between a novel and an autobiography. Both are narrative, but one is fictional and one contains information that should come from real life. And let's come back to design and special features again. Certain texts just have certain restrictions. For example, a tweet, you can only put so many characters in there. You can probably fill it up with emoji. Reports and scientific abstracts generally have charts and graphs, whereas other types of communication don't. Business documents have headings and subheadings so that busy executives can get right to the information that they want at that time. And you'll use a different font size, different balances of pictures, colors, and symbols for those as well. Just remember that you're thinking about the text as a whole, but also the parts that make it up. So just like different parts of your essay might have different purposes, different parts of your essay might take different shapes to meet those purposes. Now let's get to how to determine the thesis. You want to think about what points the text argues and when. So we've talked about how the thesis is usually at the end of the introduction, but it's also usually repeated throughout the text. At the end of each body paragraph, and most authors circle back to it at the end of the essay as well. So if you're not sure what the thesis is, check those places and see what you think. Or you can look at the first sentence of each body paragraph and connect those. Now, sometimes, as we've probably discussed in class, the thesis will be implied or it will be at the end. The key there is to paraphrase. Connect the dots of what you've read to make a bigger picture, just like you'd have to connect the dots of our picture of a not-so-friendly owl. And remember that a thesis is not a topic. A thesis calls attention to a new or debatable fact, or it expresses an opinion, or it makes a suggestion. So it's not just talking about dining options on campus in general, it's giving us a verdict on those. Now that's all pretty abstract. I've talked to you a lot about giving specific examples. So here we go. Here's an example of how I reached that statement that you saw a few slides ago about the phenomenology of error. I concluded that the purpose or the reason for this text was persuasion because in paragraph 51, the author says, I invite you to participate in the kind of research I suggested before. So that's a clue, big clue, that the author is trying to get us to do something, which is do research. I concluded that the audience was English teachers for several reasons. One is because the author cites research and texts that are about English, so the sources told me a lot about who the audience was. Also, the author uses we, and the author is an English teacher, so he's probably assuming that we are English teachers. Finally, as far as audience goes, in paragraphs 12 through 13, the author mentions going to a conference and listening to a paper on error. Only English professors do that. And he also talks about researching teacher comments. So he's shown that he really pays a lot of attention to what teachers do. Now to the form. I know that this is a scholarly article because it's in a scholarly journal, College Composition and Communication. I also know that it's an article and not a book chapter or even a thesis or a dissertation because it's less than 100 pages. In fact, it's less than 50. So I know it's an article. Those are generally short, 50 pages or less. Also, it uses diagrams. The author calls them a feature matrix, but it's a diagram. And it uses some kind of technical language that English teachers would know. So I know it's scholarly instead of general audience. Now finally, how do I know that the thesis is that English teachers should research which errors matter and only penalize students for those? Well, there's clues in several places, but remembering that looking at the end is a good place to look for a thesis, I looked in paragraph 47, and I saw that the author said, certainly notice the very opinionated language that the author uses there. How we mark and grade papers might change. Change, making a suggestion. We have to determine which rules of grammar careful readers notice and which they do not. So right there, the author is saying what we have to do and saying what changes might occur because of those things that we might do. So to sum it all up, rhetorical situation is just what the text wants to do and the shape it takes in order to do that thing. And it's made of 4 parts: the reason or the purpose for the text, the audience it wants to reach, the form it takes, and the thesis that it proposes. Now, to figure out each one of those 4 things, look for evidence in the text, but also make connections between what's in the text and other things you've read and seen. These will help you put it into place in your mind and figure out what kind of thing it is as well as what it's doing. And last but not least, when you want to write out a sentence that says what the rhetorical situation of a text is, you have a pretty flexible template. The title of the article is a whatever form you figured out it takes that seeks to do whatever reason or purpose it seeks to whatever audience it's aimed toward. That, if you're talking about ideas, or 2, if you're talking about a suggestion, whatever thesis you've determined this text advance. Now, if you have any questions, make sure to bring them to class, and I can't wait to see you and talk more about rhetorical situations.